Welcome back to another episode of the Code Podcast. I'm your host, Marilyn McIntyre, and today we have a wonderful guest on the show. With a number of degrees already achieved, Sarah Wagner-Wassen is not finished yet. She obtained her J.C.L in 2022, and she's now undertaking a doctorate in canon law. Welcome to the Code, Sarah.
Hi, thank you for having me here, Marilyn.
Thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me. Now, Sarah, we've been chatting, and you have quite an interesting journey towards studying canon law. Would you like to chat a bit about how you came to this?
Yeah, I grew up Baptist, so we didn't really have canon law. Um, I had extended family who were Catholic, and I actually went to a Catholic preschool, so that was my only previous Catholic ecclesiastical degree before the JCL, actually. We wore, hats made out of construction paper at graduation. Um, so and then later I went to St. Vladimir Seminary in New York, and I did a Master of Arts and a Master of Theology there, and then after that, I'd wanted to sort of continue on doing a PhD in like historical studies or something, so I'd done patristics and apocrypha sort of as my MTH, and life happened, and I ended up here in the Netherlands at some point. I had also gotten sick for a little while, and my husband was like, "Don't you want to go back and finish that?" And I was like, "Well, okay, but like academia is sort of in a free fall at the moment. Like, what's the point? Sort of thing." And so I was sort of looking around on the internet, looking at things I could do from here. Sort of distance learning programs and something related to my interests. There's a few, but it's always. And randomly, I came across the program at Leuven in doing the Masters of Canon Law, and it fit my life. I was only a train ride away from Leuven, and they have a distance learning program where you only have to go a few times a year, and it's affordable, which was also nice to know. And so that was like, I don't know, at the end of March or so, and I applied like a few days later, and I was accepted for that fall because, my MTH was the prerequisite that I used for that. So it all went through, and then I started. And
And so how did you
I don't
find
know.
the experience?
Yeah, it's something, it was interesting. European universities work differently from sort of an Anglo-American system, which is sort of how I, started, a few months later after applying, which probably wouldn't happen in America. But it was also, things just work differently. But, and there was a lot for me to sort of catch up on, things that I never learned in Catholic preschool that the professors were talking about. And but I formed a good group of friends with my classmates there, and made a WhatsApp group, and we sort of helped support each other through the whole thing, and that was really helpful. That's always my tip for people going into canon law degree programs is to find a group of friends, find your helpers, as you say, because it can be a lot. It's definitely it can be intense at times. Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. And with your background being Baptist and I think Anglican, is that correct?
Yes. Yes.
How did you find the process of studying Catholic Church law? What stood out to you in that?
Yeah. The code, the 1983 code, as a comprehensive code, it's a very interesting sort of, just to learn, because it has to make a coherent whole, right, within a legal system. So just realizing, all these different parts have to, they, when you go into classes, they tell you, part of thinking like a lawyer is that there's never any one line. There's never any one, words, in the law book, which, is the only thing that applies to your case, right? You have to look at, the whole system and seeing how that works. And I had just studied history and theology before, not anything in law school. So also sort of that whole system of trying to like think like a lawyer, and as they say, reading across the code. That was something that, yes, let me take general norms the first semester, that, I just sort of had to like drown myself in. And then at the end of the semester, you have like 2 months or so just to like realize how to think differently, say no pressure, and but it was really helpful though to sort of get that presented right off the bat, and sort of thinking about that you have this whole book and it has to go together, and you're here to figure that out, how that works.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
And so coming to the end of those studies, some canon lawyers, they specialize in particular areas. So some work in the area of penal law, some will work in marriage law. Was there a particular area, or is there rather a particular area that you specialize in?
I want to focus mainly on religious law. I mean, you only take one class on that section, but I wrote my J.C.L thesis also on that. I had spent some time at religious institutes over the years with friends who are religious. So I'm also an outsider to their world also, so it doesn't, matter so much. But that also sort of gives me a different perspective on, issues that go on. Because I think, sometimes things can feel very personal when you're inside of a certain, construct. And then, so it's, as a secular person, sort of, looking through the issues for them and sort of giving another perspective on how things should work according to the law. That can also be helpful if you also have a good understanding of like their life, their priorities,
Yeah, absolutely. And so are you working,
how they want to live. That's also important.
of course, of course. And are you working in sort of the canonical space at the moment, Sarah?
I do some independent contract work for an independent canon lawyer, just sort of drafting things that go back to him for review, and then they send it all in. And so it's mostly priests and religious doing an administrative process,
Of course,
and
of
but
course.
that's really interesting.
What part of it
That
do you find interesting?
just sort of trying to fix their issues for them and sort of protect their rights. I think that's an important thing. Because I mean sometimes people feel like they're being pushed around or something by their bishop or their superior,
Of
and they
course.
don't always know why they feel like it's not right. It's not right. And it's like, well, why isn't it right? And then that's sort of your role as the canon lawyer, is to really delve down into what canonical issues
Yeah,
really are going on
absolutely.
there, and
Hmm.
their rights, being violated in some way, and then you can help them through that. So, I find that sort of, it's interesting. It's much more interesting for me than marriage law or
Yeah, of course.
a
Of
matrimonial
course.
tribunal.
Yes, of course.
That's its own thing.
And I mentioned at the beginning of this episode that you are undertaking a doctorate in canon law. What area are you focusing on for your thesis?
I'm looking at the canonical regulations for clerical families throughout the Middle Ages,
Hmm.
sort of how it moved from clerics that they did have wives or family at some point, usually before they were ordained, and that there was canonical regulations also that applied to them. And, until eventually, around Trent or so, you got to, the modern practice where usually clerics have never been, married. They've always been celibate. But, before that shift happened, there was a lot going on in canon law. So I'm trying to sort of use canon law to see the people that were impacted by those regulations, the women or the children,
Of
and
course.
see what their lives were like under
Um,
that. Yeah.
and what does that research look like? Like how does it take its form? What texts are you looking at?
Yeah, a lot of local councils, local decrees, and also sort of the decisions made by local bishops giving dispensations or not, or recognizing marriages or not, or things like that. So it's a lot of if you're trying to look at how things impacted particular persons in history, trying to dig out what sort of legal things were applied to them over their life, decrees or judgments or decisions. So Yeah, a lot of sort of local canonical history.
And would you say that there's
A little bit
an
obscure at times.
I can imagine. Would you say there's an
Yeah.
excess of information in that area, or is it a little bit harder to find?
As far as delving into how the women were viewed, sort of if they, even if even if they were already dead before their husband was ordained. Yeah, that's not so much written about seeing them, because we talk about the history of clerical celibacy. It's usually, well, they're talking about them are the ones being ordained and what their lives are like. There's a lot about that. I'm trying to flip it to be more about the women and children who were involved on the other side of this regulation. And seeing, because there was a lot of regulations that were applied to them, such as, the wife couldn't have been previously married. And, if they found out that she had, then the husband could be deposed, and things like that. And it would, I think it would sort of put a heavy burden also upon these people.
Mm-hmm. And in your
Yeah.
research, how what other information are you finding about how the women and children were affected by this?
Yeah, we talk about, in the Gregorian reforms that they didn't want church property to be inherited. And, so the children of, clergy, I think it's easy for people to just sort of assume that because we have this conception today that clergy have been celibate usually all their life, and that's how it is, that I think it's been easy for some people to assume that all their children were therefore illegitimate or shouldn't have been there, but that's not actually the case. Like I said, some of these clergy, they had been married before they were ordained. Sometimes it was that their wife had died, and then they were ordained. So their children were, perfectly legitimate. And but then when these rules came in about inheritance, then suddenly they were themselves somewhat disenfranchised and sort of got caught up in this whole issue of, well, even if you are legitimate and maybe you did study and you went, and studied at the Abbey and whatever, and you were a good person, but they still didn't want them to inherit the same, parish perhaps as their father, just, nepotism or whatever. So they had to move. And it would make their lives more difficult than for, say, the son of a carpenter or a mason or so on, who would be expected to fill his father's shoes. So, just sort of looking at that dynamic and how sort of canon law sort of was trying to solve an issue about inheritance of church property, and then also made, life difficult for some people who didn't do anything wrong. So, that's one of these sort of side issues that I'm looking at.
Yeah, it's fascinating. It sounds like there's a lot of information there for you to process to put together your thesis.
Yeah.
And how far
Yeah.
into the doctorate are you?
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I've written bits and parts for conferences and other things. So I'm hoping, within 2.5 to 3 years to be completely done.
That's wonderful.
Hopefully. Yeah.
And so well, all the best with it. Going back to what we were talking about before, the work you're doing for independent canon lawyers, working with, it sounds like clergy, upholding their rights. What principles would you say guide the work that you do for these priests and with these canon lawyers? And is there any scripture or theological texts that guide this work?
Yeah, I don't, I just want to sort of see justice done. I mean,
Mhm.
everybody has their own faults, The only perfect, defendant was Jesus in the world. So, I mean, the canons are set up to judge everyone the same way and to judge them fairly. And people should be able to trust that the canons will work for them to bring a resolution to whatever conflict or problem that they're in. Yeah, and that, so they can just have trust in the process and feel confident that, that they're, standing is secure without, sort of, how do you say, being judged unfairly, I guess you could say. Yeah, because sometimes, once you get into this, sometimes, even if priests are accused of things, a lot of times they feel like they don't have a forum to defend sort of gets lost in that process. And so
Absolutely.
a lot of them can feel very upset about that. And yeah, and that's also an issue, just trying to, sort through, they feel like they've been unjustly accused and they've never been able to, defend themselves. And so just sort of, yeah, getting them sorted out the best way you can.
And would you say
Yeah.
that you've done a lot of work, or rather, have there been many priests that you've come across who've been unjustly accused and are seeking assistance?
Yeah, I mean, here and there, I mean, it's always, if nothing ever goes to trial, you have some sort of complaints on record, and then usually it, snowballs from there in trying to say, whether or not it's right or not. If there's not a tribunal, there's no, judgment either way. But I mean, if it's not actually a delict, I mean, or, anything that's, financially, misconduct or any other things. Yeah, it can be, yeah, you can look at it and say, well, the bishop's trying to protect against, anything possibly going wrong in the future. But, that's not reasonable. You can't protect from anything ever possibly going wrong. And so it feels like there should be better ways of dealing with those sorts of situations rather than, sort of taking somebody off ministry completely and taking away benefits or telling them to move or other things that we see that go on. And yeah, in which they just sort of feel like they've never had a chance to like sort of say like what actually happened, what maybe, they said something, it was misinterpreted or whatever, and you could say, well, that was, a bad thing that happened, but it wasn't terrible, it wasn't a delict, it was, and there should be a resolution there, but it's not on the level of, punishing them with sanctions, sort of correction. Sometimes I think decrees and other sort of mechanisms can get used instead of a pastoral correction. Sometimes all these cases would need. But by the time we're involved, a canon lawyer is involved, it's gotten to the point where, yeah, they've already been, applied with sanctions. So yeah, you just have to make the best of, the poor situation as it is.
Well, that's great that you get the opportunity to work to help defend the rights of priests. And I think there are a number of other canon lawyers around the world who do this work, and that's really wonderful. And I think that's a good way to wrap up this week's episode. Thank you again for joining me, Sarah, on the podcast. I have no doubt that you've provided listeners with a very interesting take on the pathway to studying canon law for someone who's not Catholic. And I do wish you all the best with your doctorate. And for those listening, I hope this has been an insightful episode for you. Please subscribe and follow the podcast and stay tuned as there'll be more episodes in the coming weeks. Thanks again, Sarah. God bless.
Thanks. Thanks, Marilyn.
Glória Patri et Fílio Spirítui Sancto, Sancto, Sicuteratin.